On February 12, 1993, in a working-class corner of Merseyside, England, a 2-year-old boy walked out of a shopping center holding hands with 2 other children. Security cameras caught the moment on grainy black and white tape. No one who saw that footage in the following hours could have imagined what those few seconds of video would come to mean. It would become one of the most haunting images in the history of British crime, and the beginning of a case that forced an entire country to ask what a child is capable of. This is the story of James Bulger. It was an ordinary Friday afternoon. James's mother, Denise Bulger, had brought him along on a shopping trip to the New Strand shopping center in Bootle, a town just outside Liverpool. They stopped at a butcher's shop. For a matter of seconds, the kind of moment every parent has lived through, Denise turned her attention to the counter. When she looked back, James was gone. At first, it felt like the situation every parent dreads, but usually resolves within minutes. A toddler wanders off in a crowded store, gets found by an assistant nearby, gets scooped up crying. Denise searched the aisles. She called his name. Nothing. Security was alerted. The shopping center was searched top to bottom. Then the police were called in, and what had been a frantic mother's search became a missing child investigation. Nobody suspected what the CCTV tape would eventually reveal. When investigators pulled the shopping center's security footage, they saw James being led out of the building. Not struggling, not screaming, just walking, holding the hand of an older child. For a while, detectives assumed the 2 figures with him might be relatives, or that they'd simply picked him up to help reunite him with his mother. There was no reason yet to think otherwise. Children don't hurt children. That was the assumption baked into how everyone read that footage. They were wrong. The 2 figures in the video were Robert Thompson and John Venables. Both were 10 years old. Over the next few hours, the 3 of them were seen walking through the streets of Liverpool, nearly 2.5 miles in total. More than 3 dozen people noticed them along the way. James was crying at points. He'd been hit on the head, and at one stage had a visible injury. Several adults actually stopped and asked what was going on. The answers were calm, practiced, almost eerily composed for 10-year-olds. That James was their younger brother, that he'd wandered off and they were taking him to find a police officer, that he'd hurt himself falling. Because the 2 boys were children themselves, nobody's instincts told them to intervene further. It's one of the most unsettling parts of the case. Not that people didn't care, but that the entire situation was so far outside anyone's expectation of what danger looks like that it slipped past dozens of witnesses in plain daylight. Eventually, Thompson and Venables led James to a stretch of railway line. What happened there was almost too brutal to comprehend given who committed it. James was beaten, his body left across the tracks in an apparent attempt to make his death look like an accident, hit by a train. 2 days later, on February 14th, his body was found by the railway. He had not yet turned 3. The investigation that followed was, at the time, one of the largest murder inquiries Merseyside police had ever conducted. Detectives pored over hours of CCTV. That footage of James being led out of the shopping center was released to the public and broadcast nationally, and it worked. Multiple people recognized the boys in the grainy image. Within days, detectives had identified Thompson and Venables, brought them in for questioning, and watched their stories fall apart under scrutiny. Both boys were charged with abduction and murder. The trial that followed, in November of 1993 at Preston Crown Court, became one of the most controversial legal proceedings in modern British history, not because anyone doubted what had happened, but because of what it meant that it had happened at all. 2 children, barely past their 10th birthdays, sat in an adult courtroom facing a murder charge, their names and faces published to the entire country. Legal scholars would later argue that England's decision to try Thompson and Venables essentially as adults, in a public courtroom under intense press scrutiny, was itself a kind of trauma layered onto an already unprecedented situation. The judge described the killing as an act of unparalleled evil and barbarity. The jury found both boys guilty. Because of their age, they weren't sentenced to adult prison. They were ordered detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, an indeterminate sentence with no fixed release date, tied instead to assessments of whether they still posed a danger. They served roughly 8 years in secure children's facilities before being released in 2001, both around 18 years old. And here is where the case takes a turn that most retellings skip past: the legal battle over what came next. Upon release, Thompson and Venables were given entirely new identities. That alone wasn't unusual for high-risk releases. What was unprecedented was what the High Court did in December of 2001. Dame Elizabeth Butler-Sloss granted both of them a lifelong anonymity injunction, a court order binding not just journalists, but effectively the entire public, forbidding anyone, anywhere, from publishing information that could reveal their new identities or locations. It's known as a contra mundum order, Latin for against the world. The reasoning was that Thompson and Venables' lives would genuinely be at risk from vigilante violence if they were ever identified. It remains one of the most extreme privacy protections ever issued by a British court, and it set a legal precedent still cited today whenever the question of protecting a notorious offender's identity comes up. That anonymity has been tested more than once. In 2013, 2 people were given suspended sentences for contempt of court after posting photos on social media, falsely claiming to show the killers. The injunction covers the internet just as much as print, and the Attorney General's office has opened investigations into breaches multiple times over the years. John Venables, in particular, has not stayed out of the system. In 2010, he was recalled to prison after he was found in possession of child abuse images. He was released again, only to be recalled a second time in 2017 on similar charges, this time also found with what investigators described as a manual on abusing children. He has been denied parole multiple times since, as recently as 2023, with parole boards citing continued risk to the public. Because of the anonymity order, even his parole hearings have had to be held privately, a fact that has itself sparked new debate about transparency versus protection. Robert Thompson, by contrast, has largely avoided further legal trouble since his release and has not been in the news in the way Venables repeatedly has. For James's mother, who has since remarried and now goes by Denise Fergus, the decades since have never really closed. She has spent much of her adult life as a public advocate, campaigning for victims' rights and pushing back publicly every time Venables comes up for parole. When his 2023 bid was denied, she called it a day to celebrate, a phrase that says as much about the length of her grief as anything else could. More than 30 years on, the James Bulger case still sits in an unusual place in criminal history. It's not simply remembered as a murder. It became the case that forced Britain to legislate around it, reshaping conversations about the age of criminal responsibility, how far anonymity protections should extend even for the guilty, and what obligation the public has to intervene when something looks wrong, even when it doesn't look dangerous.